Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second last session for the day. We have two awesome speakers joining us today talking about designing inclusively for healthcare. We have Emma and Lee. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to log off now so that they can introduce themselves. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Theo, and thank you for having us, everybody. Just so you're not all confused, I think this talk was entitled Let's Talk About Sex Again. We've renamed it to Designing Inclusive Healthcare Services to be a little bit less clickbaity, but there'll be plenty of chat about sex, so don't worry. So to introduce ourselves, my name's Emma, my pronouns are she, her, and I've been a designer for about 15 years now. So I've worked in graphic design and more recently, service design. I've done that from the UK, as well as spending some time in New Zealand. And I've spent the last kind of 8 to 9 years working in user-centered design, specialising in service design. And about 1.5 years ago, I launched my own company called Design for Joy. And I've been working kind of mainly with charities with a bit of healthcare work here and there. I'll let Lee introduce himself.
Hello everybody, my name's Lee, my pronouns are he, him. I'm a gender studies graduate from the University of East Anglia. I'm also an LGBTQIA+ and gender diversity consultant, trainer and educator as well. I've worked with different organisations and companies, one in particular being Lush, and I am currently working within the NHS as a patient experience facilitator in equality, diversity and inclusion. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Lee. So this is our debut of this talk. I've been doing a version 1 of this talk for about the last year, focusing primarily on some work I did at NHS Digital, and Lee has kindly become my partner in crime to take this talk to the next level, which I'm really excited to share with you all today. We're both really interested in talking about this subject matter. You can see how to contact us at the bottom of all the slides. We're both on LinkedIn, and you can find Design for Joy on Instagram and also on my website. I'm also on Twitter, but it's a bit of a ghost town there these days, isn't it? So, right, so let's jump into things. So why are we here? So I'm sure most of you will be aware that we're living in difficult times at the moment. There is a so-called kind of culture war raging on, and that's having terrifying consequences for trans people especially. There are strong views on both sides, but we're not here today to talk about that. What we really want to do, and what I was really keen to do with this talk, was to move past that and to just table a factual case for why it's really important that we design healthcare services to be inclusive and to meet the needs of everybody. So how are we going to do that? So we're going to talk to you about why this work is important, and we're going to do that by sharing some data and statistics, but then also Lee's going to share some personal stories that he's been gathering over the last couple of months. We're then going to move on to talking about the how. So how do you go about doing this work? I've got a couple of case studies of some work to share with you, and then we'll end with some best practice examples and some practical recommendations for you to take away. So why do we do this work, Lee? Oh no, that's me. When we do these talks, it's important to set context, and I hope that what it says on the screen, that sex and gender are not the same thing, is not new news to anybody in the room. But it's important that we share this context because often these two things can get conflated and confused, and we'll come back to that in one of our case studies later on. The UK government defines sex as referring to the biological aspects of an individual. So usually the terms male or female are used to describe somebody's sex, and this is something that is assigned to you at birth. Gender, however, is a social construct, so it relates to our behaviours and attitudes, and you may identify along a spectrum. You may not identify as a binary gender, and that might change over time. Importantly, the gender category that you identify with may not match the sex that you were assigned at birth.
We also know throughout healthcare that not everybody is treated equally. So 27 of all respondents to the Trans Lives Survey 2021 reported they've experienced homelessness at some point in their lives, and that rose to 35% for both Black people of colour and disabled respondents. So we need to start thinking about the intersectionality here as well. 63% of respondents reported experiencing transphobia while seeking employment, rising to 73% for Black people of colour respondents as well. We also know that healthcare is hard. It's hard for absolutely everybody right now. We've heard that through numerous talks over the last 2 days. But looking at the statistics again, 14% reported that they were refused GP care on account of being trans on at least one occasion. So that's at least one occasion. 45% said their GP did not have a good understanding of their needs as a trans person, and that rose even higher to 55% for non-binary respondents. And 57% of trans people reported avoiding going to the doctor when unwell. So you can imagine that's just another boundary to healthcare inequality right there.
The reason why we talk about some of these statistics is because there are humans behind these numbers. And when you're delivering or designing services at scale, and I should know this, I worked at NHS Digital for 1.5 years during the pandemic. I don't think I'll ever design services at a bigger scale than I did then. But this still applies. It applies to government departments, applies to large-scale banks, anyone that is designing for a large proportion of the population. And even if you're not, this still matters, sorry. But when you're working in those large-scale delivery environments, people like to kind of dumb these figures down to small percentages. So according to the last census, there are around 262,000 people who say that their gender identity and sex registered at birth were different. You've got statistics for asexual people there as well. And, you know, people like to say, oh, this is about, you know, this isn't even 1% of the population, you know, we don't need to worry about them. They're just an edge case, you know, but each of these 262,000 people is a human being with a life and feelings and emotions and needs that deserve to be valued in the same way that anybody else's do. And we want to bring that to life now with a few personal stories.
So in regards to these personal stories, first, I'm going to say that I don't have a clinical or medical background. So all of these stories are either personal in regards to me, people that have submitted their stories to me, or research that I've done through working within the NHS or different papers as well. So first up, we're going to look at cervical screening. So the way gender is recorded in GP records determines who is automatically invited to screening programs. So this can include things such as breast screenings and cervical screenings as well. Screening invitations are sent out to people based on the gender they are registered as at their GP practice. So the invitations don't take account of a patient's individual circumstances and whether they have a trans history. So in this instance, let's take me. I'm a transgender man, but my NHS record still has a big F walloped on it. My reasoning for that is, at current, if I change my gender on my NHS record, my current record will be put up on a shelf somewhere and I'll get a brand new record and a brand new number, and there really won't be any communication between those two. This also means, as I previously stated, I won't get referred to my GP for any cervical screening, which is really important to me as I do still have my cervix. And obviously that can lead to health inequalities for myself, and similarly, it happens to other trans men and trans masculine people and non-binary people too. And we also, again, talking earlier about intersectionality, we need to consider how appointments can be missed and a person can go untreated. It's not just as simple as always putting something into a calendar. Many people have issues with neurodiversity as well, where they just cannot retain that information no matter how much they try. So getting those appointments sent to us is really, really important. And these are just small things that can be changed within the cervical screening process. My next case study is in regards to maternity. So in this instance, the patient is a pregnant transgender man who is looking to book his first midwifery appointment. So very first hurdle. He filled in an online self-referral and mentioned being transgender on the form, already preempting that this might be a bit of a struggle because he's transgender. He was repeatedly told it wouldn't be possible to book an appointment, that the computer system would not allow people with a male gender marker on the record to be booked into maternity appointments. The way the maternity appointments eventually happened were that the patient's hospital record had to be disconnected manually, and then also manually had their gender changed on the system to female. So not only was this frustrating for the patient, it led to some dysphoria, some ill ease while in the hospital situation as well. But the whole instance is full of risks for the parent and the baby. This was their first appointment. Many things could have happened up until that point, and it's also worrying to consider that this could be happening in other places that we're just not necessarily hearing about, and it could happen to a worse effect too. So blood tests. Due to the systems within the NHS at present, if a transgender man who hasn't changed his changed his NHS record to male is pregnant but doesn't know it, so has gone for routine blood tests or something else, goes to the doctor, has those blood tests will come back telling him that he has prostate cancer, even though he's pregnant. The reverse will be true of a transgender woman, so she could go to the doctor for routine blood tests, could actually have signs of prostate cancer, but it will come back and say that she's pregnant. Now, these are things that would be solved very, very quickly. People would realize what had happened here. But errors like this waste valuable time and resources, and these are resources and time that can be put into different cases where they're more needed. And then we have from the Oxford Academic Journal an instance of a kidney transplant. So a trans man went to emergency care and tests were run on his kidney function. The lab results are different if assessed using the male equation or the female equation. So on the basis of male categorization, the patient was diagnosed with stage 3 chronic kidney disease. The patient was also considered for a renal transplant, but because the medical care team did not consider the history of his gender, he was not listed. So in this instance, the patient's male calculated renal function was above the cutoff, so that's why he wasn't listed. The medical care team did not consider that the sex-based equations would lead to different interpretation. So the patient at that point should have been put on the list at that point, but wasn't. Eventually, further discussions happened, and the patient was put on the list and did have the transplant, but it didn't happen as soon as it should have. And again, it's a huge amount of risk.
So those are all kind of real human beings. You know, that is clinical risk that is being put in place because of how our systems and our services are currently designed. And Lee, nicely brought those to life as human stories. What we want to move on to now is talking a little bit about how might we do some of this work. So there's clearly a lot to do. As I alluded to before, I've got a longer talk about one of these case studies that highlights how much work there really still is to do. So I'm going to talk about 2 case studies today. We did have 3, but sadly the powers that be at NHS England pulled the inclusion of the one-on-one online case study at the final hour, sadly. So we're not able to share that work, but there is some brilliant work being done in that space. And I really hope that it does see the light of day sooner rather than later, because for me, services like that have high levels of clinical complexity. So that is the front door to our A&E service, basically. That's where you go if you don't know whether you're ill enough to walk into an accident and emergency service. That is a really important part of our healthcare system. So if we can crack this in a service like that, then we're really setting a really great precedent. The 2 case studies I'm going to share with you today are down the kind of lower end of the clinical complexity. The first of which didn't have any clinical aspect to it at all. It's the COVID-19 vaccination booking service that I've mentioned already. It's a service I worked on when I worked at NHS Digital. And the second is a piece of work I did in partnership with a great agency called 2CV last year around DrinkAware's digital tools. So we'll start by talking about the COVID-19 vaccination booking service. So this was the national booking service that was accessed via the NHS website. That's the team that I worked on at the time. There were other GP-run services that you could have used to book your vaccinations, but I'm sure many of you on this call will have used this service. As I said, it's probably the largest scale service I'll ever work on, and I finally had something to point at and show my family to say this is what I do for a living. So if you did use the service, you might remember that it asked you for your NHS number. And if you didn't know your NHS number, which a few people might not, I certainly didn't know mine before I started working there, it asked you for a series of demographic details. And this was because the service needed to identify who you were. So we connected it to another NHS Digital RAN service called the Personal Demographic Service, affectionately termed PDS. And this is basically a large, clunky old database that sits at the heart of the healthcare system, and it holds our NHS numbers and our demographic details. And we needed to look someone up on that system and prove that they were who they said they were before booking them that appointment. And until the final hour, we thought that the details we would have to ask people for were their first name, their surname, their date of birth, and their postcode. But at the final hour, we got told we would have to also ask them for their gender. Now, this was curious to me. Firstly, I wondered how much this would improve the match rate, as it's not very specific data. So we dug into what was going on, and it turned out this was built into the API. So it was a mandatory field that the API needed in order to do that lookup on PDS. So it included gender, but the problem ran deeper than that. So the data held within this system wasn't inclusive either. So the data is labeled gender, but the attributes held talk to someone's sex. So that's where that conflation comes in. So you're either male or female, or very helpfully, you might be unspecified or unknown. So as you can see, because of the lack of inclusivity at the heart of the system, it made it very difficult to design an inclusive screen that somebody was going to use. I do like to point out when I talk about this work that the data was not being stored. So we weren't keeping it, we weren't using it for clinical reasons, we weren't using it for monitoring reasons. It was simply to do that lookup to check that you were who you say you were. The reason why I say that is I once broke Twitter because people thought I was erasing their sex data from their NHS record. Sadly, I don't have those powers. So we set about creating this screen, and we worked across disciplines. We worked with the amazing LGBT health team in NHS England and a really great content community across NHS Digital. And we looked at how we could design the most inclusive screen possible. We did explore technical solutions. So I was really keen. We didn't just jump straight to designing the screen straight away. And we tried to look at whether there were ways we could do it kind of under the hood, so to speak. We did explore some solutions with our technical architect, but none of those were deemed viable because they were going to put too much load on the system. This was a really high profile service, you'll remember at the time. A lot of unknowns about usage as well, and whether people were going to run to kind of test it out of curiosity. Why people, I was going to say why people had nothing better to do, but everyone was locked in their houses, weren't they? So it might have been a fun game. So this is what we designed. This is the screen, and we were very keen to not include the term sex or gender in the header for reasons why I've explained before. We wanted to explain really clearly and simply why we were asking, and we wanted to provide inclusive options. So if you click female or male, it will do just one lookup and it will find you. If you click any of those bottom third, fourth or fifth options, you'll see the labels on those options don't match the data in the system. And that's because it's just going to do all the lookups. So it's going to look through all the 4 options you could be and it will find you. And that was deemed possible because there would be a smaller percentage of people clicking one of those options. And that 5th option is specifically to cater for people who might be going through transition, and they might know full well that data held on the system doesn't match how they self-describe. But we didn't want people to have to face dysphoria by clicking an option that they don't identify with. So that question did go live in the first release of the service. It was live for about 9 to 10 weeks, but I really wanted to make the case for changing it. I didn't believe we needed that data to book somebody's appointment, and it was simply something that was built into the API. And I've got a much longer talk about this case study, as I said, that goes into the details of how I went about championing for that change. But we did get the change made, which was was really great. And about 9 or 10 weeks after, the question was removed from the service, which at the time felt like a long time. But in the grand scheme of the life of that service, which has now, I believe, been repurposed for flu vaccinations, 2 years plus later, it actually wasn't that long. So the second case study I want to talk about is some work I did with DrinkAware, which I did last year through Joy. And this was a piece of work that I did in partnership with a brilliant agency called 2CV. They led on a really in-depth piece of research, and I did the design work. And the brief was to look at DrinkAware's digital tools. So you might have been on their website. You might have seen they've got a number of digital tools you can use to assess your drinking behaviour. There were 3 different ones we were working on, but there were very similar things they were looking to achieve with all. So I'm just going to share one of them today. And they were really looking at how they might make those tools work better for gender diverse audiences. And you'll see that this is what they had. And actually, if you're all Googling DrinkAware right now, I think it still looks pretty similar, because they are looking at redeveloping their tools more generally. And I think they're going to implement those changes when they make those changes. But what they had was quite a binary question about sex. These lovely symbols, which I'm not sure what purpose they were serving, and quite vague descriptions of why they need to know the information. So this was kind of a content design job, I suppose, looking at how we ask, when we ask, whether we use written content or whether there's a need for anything beyond that. And the first thing I did really was this job with this brief was think about, why are we asking? So I think that's the first thing you should always consider with any of these projects. Why do you need this information? If you don't, simply don't ask. But when it comes to clinical situations, there are definitely reasons why you might need this information. And I was particularly interested in exploring the clinical aspect of this one. And as I said before, it wasn't super clinically complex, but I didn't understand the differences that alcohol has in terms of its effect on male and female bodies. I wanted to know, does it affect male and female bodies differently? Is that going to affect the calculations that the tool makes in the background? Is that why we need it, basically? So we were kind of we didn't have a lot of access to a clinician during this project, which was difficult, and I would recommend that with any of this work. Make sure you do get clinical input. But we were also talking, the bulk of this research was with trans and non-binary people. And as we started to talk to trans people especially, things got a bit more complicated when you started considering trans people taking hormones. So it turned out it was quite nuanced. And the best that we kind of got in the end was that it's to do with differences in body fat to water ratio. And we, like I said, we did get some clinical advice on this, but the problem was there's a real lack of research on trans bodies. DrinkAware are really keen to change that. But at present, we didn't have a lot to go on. And we were curious about how much detail users would want us to go into when we were describing this. So we tested out different messaging, testing out whether people would want to be linked out to places to find out more information. Again, that was problematic because there weren't obvious places to link people to. Again, this is something DrinkAware are looking to change. And language really does matter in these situations. So I showed a few examples of the kind of descriptors we tested, but the headers were really important as well. We found out through the research that the term registered can be triggering for some people, and assigned is preferred because it talks to the choice being out, so that the assignment of your sex being out of your control, which people tended to prefer. We also did some research with cisgendered users, and DrinkAware were keen to strike that balance. Obviously, a large proportion of their users will be cis, and it turned out that the term that kind of struck the balance was sex at birth. So that is what we used in the end. Another important thing we learned was the inclusion of the word identity after gender, because it's a lot more personal to people. So these were the final designs that we made recommendations around to Drink Aware, and versions of these were kind of rolled out across all of their different tools that they had. So the most important move was to move to asking about sex and gender separately. So they were currently only asking about sex in quite a binary and strangely visual way, if you remember. Really getting it right when you're explaining why you're asking. So we did a lot of work testing that descriptor, as I said, and providing links for people who want to know more. And importantly, really providing those inclusive options where people see themselves in. We did a bit of research around pre-populated options versus open text, and people prefer to see themselves represented in those options. So this is what we put forward. So those are the two case studies we wanted to share. We're going to move on now to Lee's going to share a couple of best practice examples, and then we'll wrap up with a few practical recommendations. We will have time for some questions at the end, so if something's been on your mind, feel free to pop it in the chat box, and we'll come to that when we finish.
Thanks very much, Emma. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a couple of best practice examples, one of them being radiography and another being transgender patients' NHS records as well, and how they are linked together. In these instances, they're both very simple fixes that seem to take a long while to come about. And what I'd encourage after looking at these two is to see kind of how simple they can be, but also how you can apply them to your work as well, and take a deep dive into your work and how you can make it more inclusive for people that are gender diverse. So the first from the Society of Radiographers is, as it would say, about radiographers. So in 2018, the ionizing radiation medical exposure regulations of 2017 came into effect in the UK. Its purpose is to protect individuals from the harmful effects of ionizing radiation and making sure that no one turns into the Hulk or She-Hulk. A change of wording was made in the written procedures from making inquiries of females of childbearing capacity, which is very long-winded, to the nearly equally long-winded but a bit better individuals of childbearing potential. This caused healthcare professionals to reflect on existing practice, because it was recognized that assuming a person's sex registered at birth from their appearance or relying on a single sex marker in their NHS record introduced risks of accidental irradiation of a fetus. So as I was referring to with the personal stories beforehand, you cannot just rely on a single sex marker in someone's record, because it does not provide their history. And this doesn't just mean trans people. There are non-binary people. There are people that are intersex as well to consider, people that are regularly taking hormones for other conditions as well. All of these things need to be considered. The Care Quality Commission highlighted a case where a pregnant trans man had been irradiated during a CT scan because he was not asked about possibility of pregnancy. They made an action for employers to make sure that procedures in imaging and radiotherapy departments are inclusive of transgender and non-binary patients, including the procedure of making pregnancy inquiries. The second is about NHS Patient Records, as I alluded to previously. So this is shared with the consent of Sally Beryl, who is the Head of Data Security and Protection at Northampton General Hospital NHS Trust. So Northampton recognised that they, like so many other hospitals and healthcare establishments, did not have a process in place to manage transgender patients effectively. So they had noticed that risks were happening, as I previously discussed, when it came to patients that were gender diverse and gender non-conforming as well, and they needed a way to make it better for those patients. What they've done is a huge amount of research. They've obviously spoken within clinical professionals, medical professionals as well, likely their own patient experience team too. But what they have done is reached out to the transgender, non-binary and gender non-conforming community around Northampton and basically the patients that they serve, and have come up with something that best suits them. So they've established a model whereby the patient is able to make an informed choice about their medical record and how their gender is recorded on their hospital's clinical records. So as I was talking about in regards to cervical smear tests, what they are doing is having conversations with the patients to let them know that, yes, you can change your gender, but then you may not get notification for this. This might not be considered, this might be considered. And they're talking through all the necessary risks with them to make sure that they have informed consent in this instance, and can make the decision that they think is best for them. So yeah, as it notes at the bottom, they have adopted the consent model, which gives the patient the opportunity to understand their options, which is incredibly important. And as Emma spoke about earlier, it's really, really important that you, in these projects, you're talking to the people that it actually impacts, and you're talking with people with lived experience as well. And it's why I really commend Emma, and I'm really privileged to be in this chat as well, because Emma's here talking about gender diversity and is giving a trans person a place to speak. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Lee. So this is our final slide. We wanted to leave you with kind of 5 practical takeaways, and based on what Lee just said, I might add a 6th to this, but the first I've mentioned already, but when you're doing any of this work, early on, just really think about if you need that data. If you don't, simply don't ask. It's as simple as that. If you do need it for some reason, that's okay, but really make time to understand why, so that you can explain that to the people you're asking it of. I think it's really important, and we worked hard on this in both of those projects that I've talked through today, that you're as transparent as you can with the people using services. It's not always easy. Sometimes the real reason is there's this crappy old system that's 15 years old and we can't change it. You obviously can't put that on the screen of a service, but you know, try and be as open and honest as you can around, and that will help with people handing over this information to you. Importantly, don't make assumptions when you're designing your service. Make sure your service isn't making assumptions about people. People come with all sorts of differences and intersectionality, as Lee has highlighted already. So take the time to think about whether your service is only designed for certain people, or, you know, binary gender. There are all sorts of different ways that we are different in all sorts of beautiful ways. So please make sure you're thinking about all those things when you're designing your service. And the 6th one I would add, which I'd probably slip in here, so 3A, is involve these people when you're designing your services. I didn't include this in the case study about the NHS digital vaccination service, but I go into it in a bit more detail in the longer version of the talk. But we did do user research when we were designing that screen. That piece of work I talked through was about an 8-day period of time, of which everyone was the most stressed they've probably ever been in a work environment. And we still made time to do user research. We found 5 trans and non-binary people and tested that screen with them. So if we could do it then, frankly, there's no excuse for anybody out there working in a non-pandemic situation for making the time to involve these people in your work. Really look out for the barriers you're putting in people's way. And they might not, you know, always be apparent straight away. I'm hoping we might have shed some light on some things today, that you might go back into the work that you're doing and look out for these things. I know I can't look at a form anymore without seeing the kind of options it offers me when I'm asked those questions, for example, but the barriers might equally be lurking elsewhere. So really kind of have your eyes open when you're doing this work. And the most important one for me, and the message I always leave people with when I do my other talk, is that I really think at the heart of this is the need to change these legacy systems and data structures that lie underneath a lot of these digital services that we're designing on a daily basis. I think as a UX community, as a design community, we're getting a lot better at designing inclusive kind of front ends to our services, the screens that people see and use every day. And there's always more we can do. There's always best practice that we can push. But where we need to really kind of lean in and mount the case for change is around these legacy expensive systems that are not going to change because one person puts their hand up and says this isn't inclusive. You need to find multiple teams that are all facing the same issues and mount those cases for change together, because if we don't, we'll be forever plastering over the cracks. So that's it from us today. I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you to Lee. We met about 3 months ago. We haven't ever met in person. He reached out to me offering support when I was going through a personal situation, having difficulties with the healthcare system, purely out of the kindness of his heart. And then I talked him into doing a talk with me, which he probably didn't see coming. But I've had a lovely time, and we have already talked about taking this on tour and getting a bus and T-shirts. So if anybody else has an audience for this talk, we're really passionate about the message and we'd love to deliver it elsewhere. So we'll leave you there, but Theo may or may not be here.
Theo is here.
Yes.
I've been listening to your talk all the way through. Fantastic talk. Thank you both. Really appreciate your time and effort. And I know there was a lot of sort of effort, especially since you guys haven't met, with both your schedules being extremely hectic. Just a couple of points there. I think Jeremy Keith just wrote about, I wrote about good experience with the vaccination booking form at the time, and he puts a link in the chat. Thanks so much for the talk. Really interesting and such an important topic. I can definitely see a workshop developing around this talk, to be quite honest.
Yes, we should probably do a troll on conferences looking for workshops.
I definitely think we should be speaking more about this. But thanks you once again. But thank you again, Emma. Thank you very much, Lee. And have a lovely day further. Ciao.
Thanks
Thanks very much, everybody.